Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 15th of June 2015, Susanne Burns discussed new ways of working for art and culture organisations.
Thank you, Esther. Can I have my paper? I'm going to start with a little bit more by means of context, because what Esther gave you was very much a kind of highlights of a CV, I think, in terms of my professional journey. I was born in Bolden Colliery. I'm the granddaughter of a miner. My paternal grandfather was a miner. My maternal grandfather was a crane driver in Swan Hunters. So I was very much a child of the 50s, benefited from free grant-aided university education, and I grew up, probably not unexpectedly, as a socialist. My granddad actually registered me in Young Labour in my early teens and took me on my very first march against apartheid in the late 1960s. And I guess all of that means that I've probably carried a set of values with me since those formative childhood years. However, I was lucky. I went to university and I graduated from the University of Newcastle with a degree in English literature. I don't quite know how I managed it, because most of the time I was at university, I was dancing. I discovered a love of contemporary dance while I was at university in the late 70s. And so when I left university, I actually went to Holland to do some dance training, and then I volunteered on a kibbutz in Israel, lived there for a few years, and I came back and gradually moved into teaching as a teacher of dance and drama, with my first job being at Biddick School in Washington, which was a brand new, comprehensive, purpose-built, and I was in the first team of teachers to work in that school. It was hugely innovative at the time, a very innovative head teacher, John Philpott, who wanted to have dance on the curriculum for all children, right from the age of 11 through. So I suppose I was just really lucky, in finding those opportunities and being able to cut my teeth under very innovative and inspiring people. And that followed through, because I found my way gradually into arts management under the guidance of some very special people at Northern Arts, including Esther, actually, who I worked with in the mid-80s. So the Northeast's in my blood, it's in my heart, and yet, strangely, in 1988, personal circumstances, I relocated to Merseyside. And people told me it would be really familiar. It would be, very similar. You'd settle really well there because the two cities are very alike. And there's some truth in that. But I guess I got off on the wrong foot. Here's a kind of personal anecdote. I moved in 1988. Now, I don't know whether you remember, but in 1988, Militant had control of Liverpool City Council under Derek Hatton. I moved to the Wirral, which was a very safe Labour seat, Frank Field's seat. And I wrote to the Labour Party to say that I wanted to transfer my address and transfer my membership of the constituency Labour Party to the Wirral. But Frank Field was taking a very, very strong stand at the time against Militant. And I'd been in Newcastle Central, and I was a very young deputy chair. Result: letter from Neil Kinnock expelling me from the Labour Party on suspicion of being militant and having moved to the Wirral in order to infiltrate the constituency Labour Party. And I was only readmitted to the Labour Party 2 years ago. However, so enough personal stuff. On the good side, I found myself working for Merseyside Arts prior to the restructuring of the funding system in 1991. And I freelanced, working for companies, artists, working through the very early days of the professionalisation, if you like, of the arts. 3-year funding agreements were being introduced, which meant that arts organisations had to produce business plans. And I have a very vivid memory of being sent on a course to learn to write a business plan in 1990. So the arts were professionalising, I had to as well. An MBA followed, and then eventually a job leading the arts management degree at the newly founded LIPA, Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts, otherwise known as the Paul McCartney Fame School. So it was at that point that my career started to span beyond the arts sector into the higher education sector. The 7 years that I spent at LIPA were among the most rewarding of my career, and I only left because I started to feel irrelevant to the students. I started to feel that I wasn't enough at the chalk face. A bit like St. Peter at the gates of heaven. I was letting them go into organisations on placement, and I missed that. So I left, and I moved, as Esther said, to a senior leadership role at the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic and then at FACT, and then started my own consultancy in 2004. I've since worked across the UK, in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, as well as in North America and Europe. My work's encompassed strategic planning, organisational development and research, evaluation, with a lot of other things in between. But at heart, I suppose, I've remained a teacher and a facilitator, and this approach tends to inform all of the work that I do. In 2014, I relocated back to the Northeast, and here I am. After 26 years in exile, so it feels, I came home. Now, to the kind of crux of what I'm here to talk about. People were right when they said to me when I originally relocated that there were similarities between the two regions and the two core cities of Liverpool and Newcastle. But there are some fundamental differences too. My perspective shifted and altered over the years as I've worked across the UK. And I've worked in the arts through many policy shifts, many different political regimes, different ideologies. My commitment, my values are the things that have remained steadfast. So I want to take a look through the looking glass. I want to take a look at the two cities and the cultural infrastructure. I have to say, I had intended to do it through my own camera, and I had a whole series of images and then realised I couldn't show slides. So you're just going to have to imagine that some of the things I say would have been accompanied by some nice images. But maybe that has spared you my somewhat amateur photography. So I'll try to draw some verbal comparisons and shed some light on approaches to change, sustainability, and ultimately, I think, to the very survival of the cultural institutions that we have in the hard times that we're currently facing and the harder times that are yet to come. The two rivers, mainly, are the thing that connects the two cities, the Mersey, the Tyne. But where Newcastle has its 7 iconic bridges, Liverpool has 2 tunnels that go under the river. But we also have the Mersey ferry and the one bridge over the Mersey at Runcorn. The shipyards are almost dead in both cities, although they do operate as docks, but mainly as export-import holding docks. Industries largely premised on call centres and service industries, and of course the mines have all gone here in the northeast. So the village that I grew up in now survives on employment in a large Asda superstore. And although the old pit cottages, the stock still exists, the working men's clubs are there, the place bears no resemblance to the place that formed me. We lost communities and a whole way of life, and this still saddens me. And I see that in Liverpool, around the Litherland areas, around Bootle, where all of the areas that were populated to support the docks, actually, are now lost areas of the city. On the other side, the architecture, the grand architecture in the city centres differs. And there are iconic, beautiful streets, beautiful cathedrals in both cities, the docks in Liverpool that have been regenerated and now house a lot of the cultural institutions, and of course the quayside here. So the cities have regenerated in very similar ways and have this incredible sort of rich architecture and infrastructure. And of course, both cities share a love of football. Liverpool with its 2 teams and Newcastle United. And music is a common recurring theme in both cities. The demographics are very different. The population of Liverpool is 470,780 at the last census, whereas Newcastle is 286,821. So that's a massive difference in terms of scale. And there are varying degrees of deprivation. Liverpool is number 1 on the IMD rank average score. It's the most deprived city in the UK, whereas Newcastle is the 40th most deprived city in the UK. and slightly different multicultural profiles. So there's some quite fundamental differences there in terms of the dynamic within the city and the culture that emerges as a result of that. We share iconic public artworks, Anthony Gormley's artworks, The Angel of the North here and Another Place on Crosby Beach must be two of the most loved works of public art in the UK. And if we look at the arts and cultural infrastructure, there are direct parallels between venues and institutions. Tate Liverpool, one of the outsourced venues for the Tate conglomerate, opened in 1988. Baltic, I'm not sure actually when it opened, early 2000? 2002, yeah. So, both quite similar homes of modern art, but opened at very different times. But both the kind of, in their environments, both part of the regeneration of major new parts of the city, albeit that Baltic is, of course, in Gateshead. Liverpool Philharmonic Hall, which is the oldest concert hall in the UK, and then Sage Gateshead, which is actually one of the newest, if not the newest. And they are both leading in harmony projects. There are only 6 in harmony projects across the country, projects that work with young children in primary schools, developing a love of orchestral music. And 2 of the 6 are run in Liverpool and in Newcastle because of the areas of deprivation. In Liverpool, we have the Foundation for Art and Creative Technology, whereas here, there's the Tyneside Cinema. In Liverpool, Open Eye Gallery acts as a home for photography and for a photographic collective. Side Gallery does the same here. We have the Empire in Liverpool and Theatre Royal here in Newcastle, housing main stage, touring commercial work, and the Everyman in Liverpool and Northern Stage, both producing middle-scale repertory theatre. In dance, of course, this beautiful building here opened, I think, 10 years ago, maybe, Dance City, and one of the very first specialist centres for dance in the UK, whereas Merseyside Dance Initiative in Liverpool is unfortunately still struggling to find a building. And, of course, Tyne and Wear Museums and Archives, over the road, around the corner, up at the university, and then National Museums Liverpool, both operating on multiple sites between 7 and 9. So very, very similar infrastructure, as you might expect in major cities. Both cities also have thriving independent sectors and creative digital communities that are very rich and entrepreneurial. In Liverpool, there are a series of streets called the Baltic Triangle that contain old sort of warehouses that fed the docks and supported the docks. And that's now a home to a really growing, massively growing community of independents, photographers, visual artists, craft makers, and lots of venues that offer kind of alternative music and entertainment offering, which is very similar to the Ousburn area here. In terms of higher education, Liverpool has 3 universities, John Moores Liverpool University and Hope University, whereas here, of course, Newcastle and Northumbria. And Liverpool also has its conservatoire in LIPA, Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts. So huge student communities. I don't know what the combined student community is here in Liverpool, in Newcastle, but certainly in Liverpool it's over 500,000. Coastlines, beautiful proximity to major, areas of national interest, and public engagement and spectacle. You can see where the photographs were going to come in, can't you? Yeah. Great public engagement in terms of spectacle and events. Last year the Great North Run Festival was just amazing here, and probably about a week before that I'd actually been in Liverpool to see the Giants coming back to the city and parading through the streets. So cities that really do engage people on the ground in these massive major events. So what does all of that suggest? You could argue that we could compare any 2 major cities in this way, but I'm not so sure. I think both are cities that have pulled themselves out of different kinds of adversity. There's a strong culture in both cities that could be characterised by pride, different kinds of pride. And I know that's a word which is used very loosely, but I think for me there is a real difference in the pride in both of these cities, and having spent a lot of time in both, I really feel the difference. It's textural, you can sense it. There's a pride in the heritage, pride in people, a pride in communities and in ourselves. And both cities are fiercely loyal. However, in Liverpool, you either belong or you don't. And believe it or not, with this accent, I didn't. I just never, ever was accepted in that city. It has a very insular sense of pride. It's very much a place for people who were born there, if you like, and very difficult to be accepted. So you can imagine, from what I've been saying, what it might have felt like in 2003, when the announcement was being made for Capital of Culture, due to happen in 2008. There's me, half of me completely torn, wanting Newcastle Gateshead to win, but the other half of me that had worked on the Liverpool bid, of course, had to be rooting for Liverpool. The Liverpool bid did win, as we all know, and it was said to have embraced the whole city by Tessa Jowell when she made the announcement. The city really needed it. At that point, Liverpool was so far behind Newcastle Gateshead in terms of capital regeneration. The capital regeneration that characterised this place just wasn't there. And the city was, to quote David Henshaw, who was then the chief executive of Liverpool City Council, the city was still a prisoner of its recent history. Liverpool was still recovering from the late 1980s and from the damage done by militant. The European Capital of Culture process gave the city the kick it needed, and we grasped it with both hands, all hands, not just both, but everybody grasped it. It was tough. And the bottom line of it was that collaboration was what made it work. And this is where I'm moving towards my arguments around sustainability and survival. The Newcastle Gateshead cultural venues already worked together at that point, and the bid had been developed in partnership between the cultural venues. Liverpool wasn't in that place. There was still a lot of competition. However, having won the European Capital of Culture bid, what happened as a result of that meant that the venues themselves formed the Liverpool Arts and Regeneration Consortium, LARC. And it was born out of the need to collaborate and to work together to make Capital of Culture work. You may not have been aware of it, or you may have been, but a whole team was appointed to run European Capital of Culture in Liverpool. And within 6 months, that team had actually all gone. And there was nobody left. So the venues themselves actually pulled themselves up by the bootstraps and said, we're going to make this work. So it could have gone so badly wrong, but it didn't. It was a really successful year. It was a really successful 5 years leading up to it. And the role of that consortium was absolutely critical. And I think in both cases, both in Newcastle Gateshead and in Liverpool, consortia working, collaborative working between the cultural venues has not just rendered those venues individually more effective, but has actually helped to increase the perceived value of the role of the arts in civic life. Sometimes people talk about social capital in inverted commas. It's one of those terms that are bandied around. And I think it's really important that cultural organisations think about what their social capital is. What is their role in civil society? If you're called the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, you're associated with that city and you have a responsibility to that city. In the same way, Sage Gateshead has a responsibility to its local communities. We're funded, arts organisations are funded by the taxpayer. And I think taking that role really seriously, unpicking it, working out what that means, is actually fundamentally the key to survival of many of our cultural organisations. Cultural organisations need to take a leadership role at the interface, that connecting point between arts and culture and civic life. What can they contribute and how do they contribute? Cross-sector working in health, education, housing, criminal justice, community, neighbourhood development, all of those things have helped to reposition arts and cultural organisations and make them stronger. But we're still in a position where we have to keep arguing our value. And I think part of the problem for us is that the arts are not a statutory requirement for our local authorities. So we have to keep making that case. Work is ongoing here in the North East to develop a case for culture, in inverted commas. There was a case for capital, which many of you will remember from the, mid-90s, I think it was. But now a case for culture is being developed to try to make the case to those local authorities for the role of cultural organisations in society. One of our strongest cases is through participation and engagement work, the kind of thing that In Harmony is doing, where Sage Gateshead are working in a local school in Elsick, working with the children, where the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic are working in West Everton and working with over 180 children every year, teaching them music and building an orchestra. And I've seen the difference. I've evaluated In Harmony Liverpool since 2009, and I've seen the difference that that's made to the perception of the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic in the city. I was told by the leader of Liverpool City Council in an interview about a year ago that when he came into power with the city, he'd had to argue constantly the case for funding cultural organisations. But once In Harmony had started to take root and people could see the impact of that work and the way that that organisation was working within a local community, he no longer had to make the case. It was self-evident. That's what I'm saying, that's what I'm talking about in terms of the role of arts organisations in civic life. Now, to pick up on the through the looking glass analogy, Alice in Wonderland, there's a wonderful quote. "There's no use trying," said Alice. "One can't believe impossible things." And the Queen replied, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." Now, I don't think necessarily that the following 6 things are impossible, but they're not easy, as they challenge accepted modes of thinking, cultures, and ways of working and doing things. I already see people in the arts and cultural sector starting to think differently. I see things starting to change, and I feel that we must accelerate that change. So my 6 impossible things before breakfast that I think would bring about that kind of change and support more sustainability, longevity, stability within our arts and cultural organisations are the following. 1, we need to change business models. Economic models are changing, society's changing, the economy's changing, and our business models need to adapt. To survive, we need to be more self-sufficient. Reliance on subsidy is a thing of the past. It can only be seen as part of a mixed economy that's diverse and therefore more resilient to changing political whims. These are frightening times, and they're set to become even more frightening. So when I see something like live theatre here in Newcastle, borrowing money, philanthropic money, developing capital infrastructure, apartments, a school, an education centre, diversifying their business and bringing in rental income, I think good for you. You know, they're the kind of things that I think we have to start playing around with, and they're risky and scary for a lot of organisations that have been very subsidy dependent. Number 2, the whole notion of public and social value. We know the arts are important, those of us that work in the arts and those of us that actually appreciate the arts, but we have to persuade a lot of people of that. I always ask organisations I work with as a consultant, Do you think that people would vote for your organisation if they were engaged in the decision-making processes behind provision of funding? And if they wouldn't, or if you think that they wouldn't, then you need to do something about it. The third impossible thing before breakfast, we need to open up what we could call our systems. We can't close barriers and boundaries around our organisations. We have to change, adapt and be open and learn. We have to collaborate and open up, become more porous, with lots more cross-sector working, ensuring that we contribute to the civic life of our cities. Universities are doing it, and we're seeing that more and more as universities are focusing on what is their civic role. We're not entitled to anything in the arts. We have to play a role. We have to earn our place. My fourth impossible thing, we've got to lead at that interface where the arts connect with the rest of society. We're not islands. People need the health and they need the arts. It's not a case of either or. For so long, we've been arguing the case for the arts on the basis of an either or argument, you know? It's not either or, it has to be everything. We've got to bury all of those historical arguments in relation to public spending and cooperate rather than compete. My fifth point is that if you're going to open those systems, people need to be working cross-organisationally in more ways, pollinating, which is kind of what happens in those collaborative models, the Lark model or the Newcastle Gateshead cultural venues model, where people are learning from each other, crossing over, exchanging skills. Our structures often don't allow for that, and I think we need to start breaking down some of those structures. My final point, and this is going to sound very, very political, and on the day that the Labour leadership list was finalised, it's probably extremely political. Final point is we need a new politics. We need a new politics that enfranchises these northern cities. Investment in the neglected north and a government that genuinely cares about equality would be something which I think would be the impossible dream before breakfast, but it would be great to see it happen. I've lived through the decimation of our cities and I've seen the death of industries and the communities that they created. We can't go back, but we can dream of a better future where those in need are cared for and not made scapegoats for a failure of capitalism. And I think our cultural organisations have to bite that bullet and buy into that kind of agenda. So I think we need a lot of rethinks. And it seems to me that this now must start to happen, not just within our core cities. We're not, again, islands, but across them. And I think it's time for much more collaboration across the Greater North and much more connectivity between the cities. And I hope I can play some sort of role in that as we move forward into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.